All right, in the last video, we were talking about how these neurotransmitters travel down the axon to the little synapse right here and travel across and bind to a dendrite of another neuron. So what we're going to do now is talk about these neurotransmitters and talk about how they communicate with other neurons. So first of all, neurotransmitters are chemicals that transmit information from one neuron to another. Now, we also have neuromodulators, amino acids, neuropeptides, nitric gases that all act the same way. So we're just going to talk about them in this one general category called neurotransmitters. So that's what they basically do, is they transmit information from one neuron to another. There are two main types. They can either be excitatory, where they excite the nervous system. They arouse the nervous system. They energize the nervous system. They could also be inhibitory, where they sedate the nervous system. So what would happen is that if you get a good night's rest, when you wake up in the morning, you should have plenty of excitatory transmitters ready to arouse you, to energize you, to get you throughout the day. And then later at night, when you get home, you'll have some inhibitory transmitters that are released that sedate you and make you drowsy and eventually put you to sleep. So that's how they basically work, two major categories. The body wants to maintain a state of homeostasis, however, which is a balance between excitatory and inhibitory neurons. For example, if we have too much excitation in the nervous system, we're too agitated, we're too excited, we're too aroused. This could lead to certain types of disorders such as anxiety or insomnia. So you may have thought about, you're laying down in bed and you have a lot of anxiety. Your mind is racing about everything that happened today, everything that's going to happen tomorrow, things that are going on in your life, and you just can't relax and fall asleep. That is when you have a state of excitation or agitation. On the other hand, if we don't have enough of these neurotransmitters, then we feel drowsy and groggy and not a lot of energy and so on. And when we have too much inhibition, this could lead to depression. So when we talk about a chemical imbalance of the brain, that's basically what we're saying, is that there's an imbalance between excitatory and inhibitory neurons. And this can lead to various types of psychological disorders such as anxiety and insomnia versus depression. So anyways, also each of these different transmitters will have a specific shape, and they're going to bind to a receptor that has a specific shape. And so, for example, if our transmitter has a round shape, it's going to bind to a receptor that also has a round shape. If the receptor has a square shape, it will not fit inside and will not send the chemical message. So just kind of like in your house, when you put your key inside the lock to unlock it, if you put in the wrong key, it's not going to open it up. But if you have the right key that matches the shape of the lock, it's going to open it up. Same basic idea. So that's how these transmitters are going to work. Now, one thing that we should keep in mind, however, is that what we're talking about now are chemicals that are naturally found in the brain, such as norepinephrine, dopamine, serotonin, acetylcholine. But there are also chemicals out there in the world that also have the same basic properties. And they can also affect our nervous system. So when people ingest alcohol or drugs or nicotine, they're going to have the same effects on the nervous system that these neurotransmitters would have. And sometimes when we have a chemical imbalance, it can be caused by ingestion of too many of these foreign toxic chemicals. So for example, if I'm at a homeostatic balance, I'm waking up properly, falling asleep properly, everything is wonderful, I have no problems. Suppose I go to a party and I ingest a drug that's excitatory, such as dopamine. What's going to happen is that it's going to arouse my nervous system. It's going to excite my nervous system, okay? And so that might be the high that you feel when you ingest certain types of excitatory drugs, for example. Now, what the body's going to say to itself is, hey, I have too much excitation. I don't like this. I need to calm myself down. And so what it'll start doing is not producing as much of these excitatory transmitters. So, for example, it may reduce the production of dopamine. And so what's going to happen is that the next morning when we wake up, because we have a lower supply of dopamine, we feel a little bit hungover. We feel a little bit drowsy. We feel a little bit agitated. We don't have proper amounts of arousal. And so suppose we want to go out again the next night and we're at a lower level than we started the previous night, if I go out to a party and I want to ingest dopamine again and get the same high I had the previous night, instead of taking the same amount I had the previous night, I have to take a little bit more tonight to get that same feeling again. And so each time this happens, where we have to increase the dosage of the drug to get the same effect again, that's called tolerance. And that's why people need more and more of a drug to get the same beneficial effect, because they're developing what is called tolerance. And this is why, sometimes people take drugs to treat, for example, depression. And after a while, the drugs no longer have an effect. They need to keep taking more and more of the drugs just to feel okay, but it's not making them any happier or any less sad or anything like that, because they develop tolerance of the drugs. And so that's a huge problem that we run into when we start messing with these foreign substances like alcohol, nicotine, and marijuana, or whatever it may be. So anyways, let's talk about some of the common neurotransmitters that we have in the nervous system and what they're kind of related to. So acetylcholine controls muscle contractions, memory, emotion, and arousal, because it's found not only in one part of the brain, but throughout the brain. It's all over the brain. So you're going to find acetylcholine in the frontal lobes, in the temporal lobes, in the parietal lobes, all over the place. Now, once again, what can happen is that when we have a chemical imbalance of acetylcholine, and this can happen naturally in the body, it could lead to various types of neurological disorders. So, for example, if I have a lack of acetylcholine, I don't have as much excitation as I should have. This could lead to problems with memory, emotion, arousal, and this is what's happening with people who have Alzheimer's disease. And once again, we can't correct this problem. We can't just put in acetylcholine into the brain and have it take over like nothing ever happened. It doesn't work that way. And so this is why these diseases become more and more progressive and worse and worse and worse because of that effect. Dopamine is also an excitatory transmitter. It also controls voluntary muscle movements. It's related to memory and emotion. And in this case, instead of having too little of a transmitter, we could have too much of a transmitter. And so when we have too much dopamine, this is related to what's called schizophrenia. And so this is why people have hallucinations, delusions, and paranoia, because they have too much excitation within the nervous system. Once again, we cannot we cannot liposuction out all this dopamine in the brain. We can't do that. We can treat it through medications that we'll talk about in a little bit, but that's what's going on with dopamine. So neurologically, the brain produces too much or too little of a transmitter for whatever reason, it can lead to these types of disorders. We also have norepinephrine, which also acts as a hormone. So if you ever watch these shows on TV where they have paramedics come in, a person is in a state of shock or they're going unconscious, they give them a shot of epinephrine. Or if you have a really bad allergies, you have the EpiPen, it's the same exact thing. So this is related to arousal, eating, and emotion. And what can happen here is that if we have low levels of norepinephrine, for whatever reason, it could be related to psychological disorders such as depression. And so low levels of norepinephrine produces symptoms of depression. What's interesting about this is that sometimes people may not actually be depressed, but suppose you have a problem with, say, with your thyroid gland. You're not producing enough thyroid. And so you have hypothyroidism. One of the symptoms of hypothyroidism is depression. And I know my wife had it for a while. She couldn't figure out why she was depressed. Nothing was going on in her life that would make her feel depressed. And so when she went to the doctor and actually got tested, they found out that she had low levels of her hormones because of her thyroid gland. And once they put her on a proper medication, the depression went away. So you need to be careful because sometimes depression may not be caused by external factors, but it could be caused by something that's going on within the brain. And then finally, we have serotonin, which is an inhibitory transmitter. It's related to arousal, sleep, dreaming, emotion. This is going to be the chemical that's going to sedate you and make you tired and sleepy at night. But here, low levels are related to anxiety and insomnia. And so if I don't have enough serotonin, I can't relax myself, I can't inhibit my nervous system. That produces the agitation where your mind just races and races and races when you're trying to fall asleep and you just can't relax and fall asleep. So that's what can happen when you have these chemical imbalances of the brain, either based on your neurology Or it can be based on your daily habits, not eating a proper diet, not getting proper exercise, not getting proper sleeping amounts every night. That could lead to all these different types of chemical imbalances. We have a couple others. We have an amino acid called GABA, and this is also an inhibitory transmitter, and this is related to anxiety when you have low levels. And then we also have the endorphins and enkephalins. These are the body's painkillers. And so if you have an accident and you cut yourself, you may have a release of endorphins to help block out the pain. Now, some people may have higher supplies. If I'm a well-trained athlete, I have a higher tolerance of pain. Maybe when a woman is going through labor and delivery, she may have a release of endorphins to help block out pain through a vaginal delivery. But obviously, in some cases, these are not going to be strong enough to prevent pain messages from causing problems. So that's why, for example, if a woman is going to be having a C-section, they give her an epidural so that it blocks pain messages from going from the lower extremities up to the brain where they perceive pain. And what the anesthesiologist will tell the woman who's having the baby is that they may feel some tugging, some pulling, but they won't perceive pain because those messages never reach the brain. And so that's what's really interesting about how the brain works, is that sometimes when you prevent these pain messages, information can't travel to the brain. Sometimes if there's a problem in the spinal column, you can't send muscle commands from the brain out to the muscles to initiate movement. And so it's just kind of interesting how all this kind of works together. Now, real quickly before we run out of time here, we can make up chemicals in the laboratory to have specific effects on the nervous system. One type of drug is called an agonist. And these are drugs that have the same chemical shape as a neurotransmitter, and they're going to have the same basic effect. So as we mentioned, sometimes your endorphins are not going to be strong enough to block out pain messages. So we give something such as heroin or morphine to stimulate those endorphin receptors to block out pain messages. And as you can imagine, this is one of the reasons why it's so easy for people to become addicted to painkillers, because of the effect that it has on the nervous system. And so these are much more powerful drugs than the enkephalins can ever hope to be. Antagonists, these are drugs that block the action of a neurotransmitter. So sometimes when you watch these commercials on TV, they talk about beta blockers and these blockers, those blockers, that's what they're talking about. These are drugs that block a receptor site. So remember we said that when people have schizophrenia, they have too much dopamine, but we can't get rid of the dopamine. So what we do instead is we give drugs that actually block the receptors. Now, this does not eliminate the symptoms. They still have hallucinations, delusions, and paranoia, but they're not as severe as they would be if they're not medicated. And so once again in the laboratory, we can develop different types of drugs. So whenever we hear about designer drugs, all we're doing is altering the chemical shape of the drugs that have a different effect. So when you talk about amphetamines and methamphetamines, basically the same type of drug, but they have a little bit of chemical differences and obviously they have different effects. And so anyways, that's how these drugs work in the brain. Once again, if you guys have questions, you can ask on the Q&A discussion board. You could ask during our weekly Zoom meeting. You can post questions through email. We'll answer them for you. But also this information is in the Rebel textbook, so read up there. And if you guys have any questions, let me know. We could go over it. So until next time, stay safe, and we'll see you guys soon.